My name is Camille Crittenden. I'm Deputy Director of CITRIS and also Director of the Connected Communities Initiative. And it's my privilege and pleasure to welcome my colleague, Brandie Nonnecke, to the stage in just a moment. She's going to share with us some of her research findings about tech for social good. She's made tremendous contributions to CITRIS over the last 5 years that she's been here, and I'm excited to be able to present her in this context. Dr. Brandie Nonnecke is a Research and Development Manager here at CITRIS at UC Berkeley, and she's also a Program Director for CITRIS at UC Davis. She's a fellow at the World Economic Forum and serves on the Council on the Future of the Digital Economy and Society. She researches human rights at the intersection of law, policy, and emerging technologies, and currently is really focusing on the benefits and risks of AI-enabled decision-making, including issues of fairness, accountability, and appropriate governance structures. So she publishes widely on these topics and also contributes hugely to the programming and other activities here at CITRIS. And you can follow her at @bnonnecke and otherwise find her work linked on the CITRIS website and on her own website. So please join me in welcoming Brandie Nonnecke.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much, Camille. Before I get into my talk, I wanted to make a quick announcement. So UC Berkeley is holding the Big Give, which will be held on March 8th. It's an online fundraising event, and we hope that you will consider contributing to CITRIS. If you go to our website, you can see Give here. We'd love your donations to help support projects like the project I co-direct, the CITRIS Tech for Social Good program, which funds student-led technology development, events and programming, and this year launched its first CITRIS Fellows program. So I'm going to contextualize my talk today about the future and where will we be in the year 2050. So currently, about 50% of the world's population lives in cities. Can you guys guess how much of the world's population will live in cities by the year 2050? 70. It's 70%, that's correct. So imagine cities as they are today, right? We've all been in this position here. This is the DMV in Los Angeles. This is hell on earth. Can you imagine what this place will be like with a huge influx of population? It'll be much worse. We will need to adopt technology in a way that makes our cities more inclusive, more efficient. We've always had a fascination with imagining technology's impact on our lives. And in many ways, these projections have come to fruition. You know, starting in the 1950s, 1960s on, technological advancements really helped to change how people began to work. Right, it offset a lot of the household labor tasks that women were faced with, and then they could expand their opportunities. They could actually move outside of the home and pursue new areas of work, contributing to the economy. But with our expectations of social benefit come dystopian projections of the impact of technology on our lives. And this is really due in large part to our lack of the understanding of how technology works, including its spillover socioeconomic effects. Arthur C. Clarke, who famously wrote 2001: A Space Odyssey, he said, "Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic." But herein lies the problem. A lack of understanding how technology works and its impacts can lead to knee-jerk reactions, right? A fear of the impact of technology. I work in researching information and communication technology policy. When we don't fully understand how a technology works and its impacts, we then try to seek to overregulate. And then the negative impact would be not allowing that technology to really develop and flourish and benefit our society. And we can see this already right now, especially within how we're thinking about regulating AI's impact on labor and the workforce. But because we don't have a clear understanding of even what AI is or its impacts, we get reports like this. So this is a meta-analysis of different reports on predicted jobs automation will create and destroy. And if you look, they're all across the board, right? It's not clear what will be the impact. So if we don't fully understand the impact, we should be very cautious about how we approach regulation. So understanding first and foremost, what is artificial intelligence? And there's really no clear definition currently. And Professor Stuart Russell said in one of his writings that it's not clear. It's a system that thinks like humans, or it's a system that acts like humans, systems that think rationally, systems that act rationally. And also, I'd just like to note that comparing the way that a system works rationally to a human, when human actors are not always rational. So there's a lot of confusion on, well, what is it, and how does it mimic human decision-making for better or for worse? But today I wanted to highlight some of the promises of artificial intelligence, some of the ways that we can apply it to make our world and our work more efficient, right? Streamlining and structuring our work in new ways, looking at data inputs and finding new patterns that we wouldn't otherwise be able to identify, making us more effective in our work, and also ways that we can actually apply AI to promote equity and reduce bias. So how can we use the big data that we've been able to collect to be able to better understand where we have perhaps historically, systematically discriminated against certain groups? And how can we apply it to correct for bias? But in order to really understand the promise and be able to achieve these social good outcomes, we do have to consider the negative. So when I think about AI and how it's developed, I think of what I call the 3 Ds: data, design, and your decision. So for me, I'm thinking, the data are like the chocolates coming in. They're coming in, they're unstructured. The design is the belt moving the morsels along, right? It's going a little too fast, the design's off. And they're making a their most rational decision they can make. And Lucy and Ethel are not making the best decision, right? They're eating the chocolates in a way and it's not going through in the way it should. So AI systems are taught what they know from training data. And bias can creep in very easily at this stage, right? The data can be incomplete, the data can be biased or skewed or non-representative. Also, bias can creep in at the design level. At its simplest form, an algorithm is simply if this, then that. And I think if anybody tells you that an algorithm doesn't have a judgment in it, I think they're wrong. Because inherent in that statement, if this, then that, is a decision. You have made a decision that some variable, some factor matters for some other outcome. And so I think especially when we're applying AI to enable decision making, especially in social services or social aspects, you have to be clear on what decisions are you making in your design. So out of this is an AI-enabled decision making. And it's critical to evaluate the data that are going into these models, trying to ensure that the data is as representative and not biased as possible. Considering the design, what factors are you considering? What are you prioritizing in your model? And then once you have those 2 parts and you're trying to make a decision, you need to determine whether the decision itself is inclusive. Is it fair? Is it just? So in this idea of the data, design, and decision, there are negative outcomes at times, and we've seen a lot of this reported in the media. Right? There's bias in our predictions, false predictions, and disproportionate impacts. How many of you have read this piece by ProPublica, the machine bias piece? Okay, so about half of the audience. This is a phenomenal piece, and I hope that you all look at this, by Julia Angwin. And what they did was they looked at a prediction algorithm that was to determine the likelihood of recidivism. And they took this model and they had their own data set that they could test the model. And they found that it was very biased against Black defendants. And the formula was particularly likely to falsely flag Black defendants as future criminals, wrongly labeling them at almost twice the rate as white defendants. And white defendants were mislabeled as low risk more often than Black defendants. So here it's, bias is probably creeping in at the data level, what data they're using to train the model, and the design, and then the end, also the decision making. AI is also used in something called predictive policing. And within predictive policing, a lot of it is determined off of historically collected data in communities. And low-income minority neighborhoods are historically much more likely to be policed than affluent white neighborhoods. Therefore, a model based off of this data would be more likely to identify potential areas of a criminal activity than white neighborhoods. Which also really upsets me because crime happens all the time in white neighborhoods, and it especially happens in affluent business sectors, right? White-collar crime. There was also another study that looked at Chicago and their use of a very similar model, but to try to determine individuals who were likely to be victims of violent crimes. And in Chicago, they took this data, they identified a list of individuals who were, according to the model, likely to be a victim, and they actually intervened, and they went to their homes and knocked on their door and said, "Did you realize that you're likely going to be a victim of a violent crime?" What do you think happened in that community? A lot of alarm. Oh my gosh, you're coming to my home, you're telling me I'm going to be a victim of a violent crime. There's a wonderful report on this by RAND. It was just released in 2016, so it's a few years old now. And what they found was there was actually no decrease in crime or in violent crime as a result of this. So even though you have the data, you have a model, and you've made a decision, and you're trying to do a social good, right? Their goal was to decrease the likelihood of somebody being involved in a violent crime. It actually had zero impact. If any impact it had, it made the community more alarmed. But I always like to find the silver lining in things. So I also want to present the ways that we can apply AI for social good. So I wanted to talk about 3 different areas: recruitment, applicant screening, and task allocation. So let's take applicant screening first. So there was a study where an individual had 2 resumes. They are completely identical, except the name at the top, one was a man's name and one was a woman's name. And they gave this application out. Who do you think got the call back? The man or the woman? Louder, the man. Okay. Then they did a follow-up experiment. They sent out an identical resume. At the top of each resume, they changed the name. One was an African-American sounding woman's name, and one was a Caucasian woman sounding name. Who do you think got the call back? The Caucasian sounding name. It's not to think that those individuals who were doing the screening process were conscious of their bias. Perhaps it was implicit bias and they didn't know that they were, in their review, that for some reason they were less likely to call back women or African Americans. And so in order to overcome this, they are using AI to do some initial screening on resumes. So they'll review for certain tasks, trying to mitigate this bias from creeping in the decision-making process. Another area is in task allocation. So for some managers, they may, without knowing, assign tasks based off of some gender assumptions, right? Maybe assigning more secretarial tasks to women than to men. And so these models will help them to try to allocate those tasks in a more fair and inclusive way. And AI will have tremendous impacts within public services. So as I started my talk today, our urban contexts are going to change dramatically in the next 20, 30 years. And AI can really help us in disaster prediction and management, right? Identifying the likelihood of a disaster, allocating resources, personnel after a disaster. A very interesting example, in the city of New York, they analyzed Twitter data to try to target inspections for like restaurants in their, what is that? Like, I don't know what it's called. I'm thinking like for foodborne illness, right? What is that? Health inspection. And so what they did was they looked at Twitter data to identify restaurants that had been called out by individuals. So they would see there's a big uptick in people saying that restaurant X, they went to it a couple nights ago and now they're very sick. And so they used that data to allocate which restaurants that they would go to for inspection. Also, AI was very tremendously used in looking at the spread of Ebola and seeing the movement of people and where to intervene and how to intervene. There's a startup that pulls large amounts of social media data and they look at it down to almost the city block level. And what they look for is upticks in certain keywords, or if they start seeing a lot of people talking about a certain location, they'll go in and look and see, well, what are people saying? So for example, if within one geographic area, 2 words coming together, active shooter, starts showing up a lot, then Banjo would be able to flag that as there's a potential issue. They were actually able to identify that an Amazon warehouse was on fire before even the fire department was notified, because people were taking pictures as they were driving by on the highway with the large smoke, and then they were able to identify that in the mapping, oh, that was likely an Amazon warehouse. And so they helped to facilitate the fire department coming in that context. So I started my talk earlier explaining some of the ways that AI has been used in very discriminatory ways in law enforcement, right? Through predictive policing or within a bias in determining the likelihood of recidivism. But AI is also applied in ways for good. There's a university project where they're collaborating with the police department to look at a backlog of police camera footage, and especially the footage that is taken of very hostile interactions between police and the public, to be able to analyze that data to look for different types of body movement, body language, the actual language that people are using, and then use that as a training method for police officers, right? So they can identify if it starts to escalate in this way, it's likely that it might move in this direction. So you should try to counter it by maybe saying this. Also, there's a very great project called Traffic Cam. And they're building a crowdsourced database of hotel room images that are being used to help stop the spread of sex trafficking. And this is also being combined with the research out of DARPA called MEMEX, which is really looking through the dark web for different ways that people are being trafficked, and then tying that to the data that they're collecting from the crowdsourced hotel images. This way they can better understand the flow and movement of human traffickers and intervene early. AI is also a really great tool to uphold our human rights. I think a lot of the discussion that we're seeing today, especially in traditional media, is about how AI is displacing labor. It has discriminatory impacts. While these are all true, I think we also have to pay attention to the ways that AI is being used for good. So right now, Amnesty International has a couple of projects I want to highlight. The first one is called Decode Darfur. And what they're doing is they're doing a computer vision machine learning model, which at first they had a lot of volunteers help to code. And what it is they have satellite imagery of villages, and they're looking at the changes in those villages to see if those villages have been attacked, if people have moved. And so then they can better predict whether or not a village is under attack or if we need to send in humanitarian aid and better track the movement of people. They've also developed a model that looks at hate speech targeted toward female members of parliament. And so through that, they're able to identify that female members of parliament are much more likely to be harassed than their male counterparts. Now, if they can identify the harassment early, then you can intervene and better control for it. The other project I want to highlight is a student-led project here at UC Berkeley. Is there anybody here from Archer? Yeah, so this is a wonderful project. You guys are a really bright group of young students. And so we were able to fund them through our CITRIS Tech for Social Good program. And what they're doing is they're pulling large, open data to help with human rights investigations. They pull that data and they streamline and they structure it, right? Allowing journalists, human rights investigators to be able to go in and make sense of this data and use it in a meaningful way, uncovering injustices and holding people accountable. I think the thing we have to think about the most is there are assumptions made when we build these models. There are assumptions made when we decide what data to collect, how to use that data, how to structure the data, what we decide in our design of our models, and then how we make our decisions based off of the outcomes of those models in our decision making. Do we take what the model has put out as this is the final decision? Do we have people come in and check it? I think especially in areas where AI-enabled decision-making affects legal due process, it's imperative to have a human in there interpreting the results, questioning the data, the design, and the decision. So Lawrence Lessig famously said, code is law. And code is crafted to reflect the choices and values of those coders. And this can undermine the rule of law in legal due process and of anti-discrimination, and it has, as we've seen with the ProPublica piece. You might have noticed that Mark Zuckerberg was in the image there, and I don't want to be completely negative about Facebook, because they're also doing really great things. So one thing they're doing right now is they're scouring the data on Facebook, and they're looking for characteristics in language found to be related to emotional stress. So these are individuals that are at high risk to themselves or to others, and they're trying to intervene. So they may try to connect them with somebody else within their network for support, or they might even put in their feed, here's access to mental health resources. But this brings up a very serious concern, right? If these platform companies are looking through our data and they're intervening in our lives, making a decision, they should have some oversight over them on how they're analyzing that data. What data are they collecting? How are they designing their models? What is their decision-making process? So that leads me to the need for oversight. And there's been a lot of movement toward this. The Future of AI Act was introduced before Congress at the end of last year. And the goal is to set up a federal advisory committee that would review AI and try to mitigate its negative impacts. But also, as I said earlier, AI, the definition of it is pretty unclear, and it's broad, right? It encompasses a lot of different technologies and methodologies. So I think this commission really will have their work cut out for them. Also in New York City, there's a New York City Council bill that has mandated that any of the city-level decisions that are being automated, they have to be evaluated to make sure that they're not discriminatory, that they are in fact inclusive and fair and are upholding the law. There's also other nonprofit initiatives like the Partnership on AI, which is a consortium of nonprofits, private sector companies who are trying to come together to say we acknowledge the possible negative impacts of AI, but also let's acknowledge the positive ways that we can build AI for the future. There's also the Future of Life Institute, which came up with the Asilomar principles of how AI should be developed and applied. And then even here at CITRIS, we have, there's academic institutions like CITRIS doing this work, the Center for Human Compatible AI, the Berkeley AI Research Group, there's the NYU AI Now initiative. And so there are a lot of really smart people working together at the academic, nonprofit, governmental level to try to address some of the risks and ensure that we can design and apply AI for social good. But I think first and foremost, in order for us to reach that point of development of AI for social good, the foundation of that is ensuring that we have inclusive innovation. So there's this book by Scott Page called The Difference. And one thing that really stood out to me and others in this room are that more diverse teams are better at solving complex problems than a homogeneous team with a very high IQ. And so if we make our teams more diverse and inclusive in the development of technology, I think that the outcome will be the development of technology that better reflects the needs of a greater variety of people. And so I have some other recommendations that I wanted to point out. So in the development of any technology, not just AI-enabled technology, but all, attention to the design of whatever you're building. Trying to understand, are you building something that will disproportionately affect a protected group? Or trying to build something that's more inclusive and reflective of the diversity of stakeholders who will be impacted by that technology. When you make a decision in the design of anything, you should be conscious of the trade-offs that you're making in those decisions. Right? If we think about AI, you have like machine learning models and you have deep neural nets, and deep neural nets are often thought of as the black box of AI. That's what a lot of people talk about when they say AI is not transparent. If you can have the same predictive outcome using a machine learning model or even a regression model, right? Something that is very simple that you can communicate, you're going to trade off a little bit in accuracy. In some instances, that might be better. Right? Especially in those where you need to be transparent, where you're affecting legal due process. And also setting up mechanisms for managing your errors, right? All AI models have error, right? If it's a model for a self-driving car, it better be pretty accurate, right? You don't want a lot of error in that. And so making sure that you're considering those trade-offs in error and accuracy, and you're communicating that. And so I've actually put my presentation today already at my website here, and I put a list of resources and readings, and also other newsletters that I think that other people would be interested in. That's it. So we have like 20 minutes for questions. That went a lot faster than.
We'll bring you the microphone if you have a question for recording.
Hello, thank you for your talk. I just had a quick question. So you mentioned AI applied for a lot of good things in diversity in terms of like job placement. What kind of things do you think AI can bring to the university level in terms of admissions for both like undergraduate and maybe graduate students?
That's a really great question. I think, well, the institution itself does not discriminate in its review, right? And I'm sure there are mechanisms in place for not discriminating against students and making sure that they don't. But I think it could be used to help evaluate proposals as they come in. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Brandie. Just to follow up on that, one of the risks in evaluating applications, whether it's for universities or for jobs, is that other types of biases or screening ends up happening as a result, of course. So for instance, now on LinkedIn, you go on LinkedIn and it tells you whether your skill set that other people have selected for you match you for a particular job. And I have to imagine that if a company is using a LinkedIn tool, they will end up using AI to screen you out of the job, whether or not you actually have qualifications that a human might be interested in looking at. So how do you think about mitigating both the, eliminating biases, but adding in new forms of biases that may in some cases be harder to track?
Yeah, I think that we have to always build in mechanisms for continuously checking the assumptions that we're making. So if we're analyzing for skills, we better evaluate whether or not analyzing for particular skills are leaving out a certain group of people. Also, another really good example, I think, is these tools, if they're looking at the type of university that somebody goes to. Obviously, certain types of groups get into certain types of universities. So then you could be disproportionately impacting those who may have the exact same skill sets, but who would be screened out at an earlier stage because they don't fit some criteria. So I think always it's questioning at the data level, what data are you analyzing, the design, what assumptions are you making in the model, and then at the decision level, always checking to make sure out of this, and let's just say that along the way we were able to minimize bias the best we could, making sure even at the decision-making level, using the output, is bias creeping in here, and always questioning and reiterating on the process.
Along that line, a question is, would the availability of these analyses and their need for data create substantial pressure for more data? Like, for instance, you gave an example of human trafficking and pictures of the hotel rooms. Would that create a pressure for a rule that all hotel rooms must have constantly on webcams, for instance, so that there is data to analyze? Or in the case of hiring and people base hiring on data that's gleaned, say, from Facebook, would that mean that a person who does not participate in Facebook is discriminated against? Or maybe a person who just doesn't post enough things on Facebook for the analysis to work, will that result in their being discriminated against?
Yeah, I think all of those are, yes, except the first, there will never be always on webcam because it would invade privacy. But, it's a volunteer, the traffic cam thing now is volunteer, that you can upload pictures of hotel rooms to help build this database of hotel rooms that then can be synced with other pictures, or knowing when actual victims have posted a picture and they can match up and know that it was likely that hotel. And then the push for more data, our world is increasingly connected, not just personally, but physically, and even Internet of Things. Data is not going to slow. The flow is open, it's not going to stop. And I think, though, you bring up a good point of those who don't participate or those who don't contribute a lot of data, then will models end up biasing against them? I think these are the questions that we have to continuously ask when we're making decisions based off of the data.
So thank you for a wonderful and illuminating talk, really amazing. My question is this: so in the law and AI intersection, we see a lot of calls, of course, for accountability, transparency, explanation, etc., GDPR. But in reality, we also understand that in order to facilitate that, we really need the help of external researchers or people in the academy like you and others that are able actually to go under the hood and explain and test the system. So we see this paradox where there is a very strong chilling effect, because on one hand, call for reform, on the other hand, DMCA, CFAA, and even contracts right now are creating barriers for basic algorithmic research and auditing methods such as sock puppet and the like. So my question is twofold. How can we work towards eliminate those barriers, first? And second, from your experience, how much is this chilling effect dominate right now, and what is the negative effect in reality? So we can actually draw him from security research. So I'm looking forward for your input.
Yeah. These are two really great questions, and I think one of the foundational problems is that of intellectual property of software. because, right, if it's proprietary, then how do you open it up for investigation by the academia to be able to evaluate whether or not something has a discriminatory impact? This is a question I can't answer. I mean, it's a very difficult question. Our legal structure has prioritized intellectual property rights on software. And so I think moving forward, as we have these discussions, I think especially in those areas where it's being used in ways that directly affects legal issues, right? Like prediction of likelihood of recidivism and sentencing, that better be open and transparent. I'm not, I would also say that other things that seem less nefarious, like even your Google feed, I mean, those can directly affect people's lives, like their access to job opportunities, right? So even, right, there was a study that showed that Google was presenting higher paying jobs to men over women. That directly affected the women's lives. I think it's very complex. I think foundationally those ways that AI is applied for legal aspects, where there's oversight, those have to be open and transparent.
Okay, so thank you for this very nice talk. I have a question, a thought actually, and I would like to see what thoughts you might have. As you know, credit ratings are done based on a model, a data-driven model, and for historical reasons, and also resisting, and also defensively, not to be accused that they're using a black box model that is likely to bias, they use a very simple model, logistic regression, open to everybody, you can see its parameters, so the model cannot be biased. On the other hand, people know what the model is and they can manipulate it, right? You can open a credit card, pay small amounts very frequently and improve your credit rating dramatically ahead of somebody else. So there's this duality there that openness is not necessarily good if it exposes you to attacks. So what are your thoughts?
That's a really interesting question, because if you know something works, you could game it, right, to your benefit. So I think it depends on the different way that it's being applied. So you can look probably to better identify whether or not somebody is trying to game the system in a way to give them the maximum benefit. And see, I mean, if it's not illegal to do it, then there's no impact, right? Somebody was just smart enough to figure out how to game your system. So I think it depends on the application of it. But also I would say even if something is open and transparent, that doesn't mean it isn't biased, right? So I think you could identify, because it is transparent, that it is biased in a certain way, but that might not change the model, especially if it's not affecting some legal right? It's just biased.
Yeah, so thank you for your talk. I have a question regarding, I guess, AI in other countries. So right now, looks like the US, it's mainly private companies leading the way in AI, but China has been heavily investing in AI since about the last 5-7 years. And their AI they've pretty much created the dystopian Big Brother future with their AI. They started, I think, in 2009 with monitoring in I forget the exact region of Eastern China for dissent. And most recently, they used AI tools to monitor social media after Xi Jinping was, I guess, the rule that he can extend his rule. And people were showing up on their doorstep. If you criticized them, police were recording your responses. So do you think that there's going to be a push for the United States, for the government to give a push to our AI? Because it seems that we're falling behind, and China is going to keep pushing their kind of dystopian AI. So what do we do about that?
Yeah, I think, of course, the United States is going to invest in AI and technology development, and I hope that they continue to do so, because our future, I mean, the fourth industrial revolution is happening now, and AI is a big part of that. And in order for us to move forward at all levels, we have to be able to develop AI and apply it in new ways. I'm hopeful that the United States doesn't follow what China is doing. I mean, they're even doing the citizen score, right, where they're looking at individual social media and determining whether or not they can, using it as a score for, like, can they get into this college? There were actually a lot of people who were banned from flying based off of their citizen score. So there are a lot of risks of the further development, but I think we should not forego the benefits because of a fear of these risks. We should manage the risks and put our effort into implementing levers now that allow us to achieve, positive social net gains in the future.
Thank you so much for your work. Back in where you were talking about inclusive innovation, that diverse teams were more effective than just intellectual teams. Is there any sensitivity training going on to help those team members identify any biased attitudes that they might have that they would not know about?
That's a really interesting point, right? So considering if you have more diverse teams, you could have a negative outcome, right? If you have people who don't understand or they have bias against each other, they don't understand the certain characteristics of groups. I think, of course, it'd probably be a very critical part of the team building process is understanding your own explicit and implicit bias and then trying to mitigate those negative effects so that you can each bring your own unique characteristics together to be able to have a better outcome. I don't know of any specific projects that are doing that other than like implicit bias training that's happening a lot in business.
I think you mentioned that there's not a set definition for AI. So I want to ask a question about that. It seems to me, in my mind, that when you have the system, like for example, in the stock exchange, when it hits a certain condition, trades start happening. There's no human intervention. So again, I'm working on definition. When there is a human intervention in the analysis of the data, I don't call that AI. I call that data analytics. Could you comment on the definitions of the difference between AI and data analytics?
Oh, I think, if the model is doing something and somebody's interpreting it, there's a model, right, that's having an output, and then you're just having a human interpret and then act on that. So I think it is intervening. It might not be intervening in that the human is, they're making the decision of what are we going to do next based off of that data. And I think you're more thinking that the data itself and the model, and then it's doing its own action. And for you, that's AI.
Right.
I think, though, you have humans working with, like, human-machine partnering, and that is a combination of the AI and the human together.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Brandie. So I'm curious that there was also another nice example of, I would say, AI for good when some students here at Berkeley developed a tool to identify fake accounts on Twitter, bots on Twitter.
Robot Labs.
Robot Labs, right. So that, is anyone here from that who worked on that group? That's a great story, I think, of essentially applying state-of-the-art machine learning and AI to a contemporary problem. And I want to come back also to the example of admissions, because I think it's interesting when we start thinking about it. Part of the problem we have is that we're inundated with so many applicants. At the graduate level, for example, we got 2,000 applicants to the AI program itself. And there has been some thinking, could we use AI in some way to sort of pull out the best ones? And here's the challenge, is that if you have some very transparent and consistent method for doing that, it will also almost inherently lit the diversity. Right, because you want, so I guess my question is diversity and consistency somewhat at odds?
That's a really good question. I think if you were building that model, you would consider we want these characteristics, but then maybe trying to find anomalies in the data and pulling those. So who are people who have some of those characteristics and then something completely outside of it? And then looking at those and pulling those for greater analysis. I think anytime you automate a process, you risk like just melting everything into something, or you prioritize certain groups out of it and leave everybody out, or leave certain people out.
Question here.
Where? Oh.
So my question has to do with the actual AI experts or people who can do analytics, because I think the situation is most of those experts are going to the Googles, the Facebooks, the Palantirs. So how do you ensure that the right expertise and resources are devoted to tech for good? Or are we just at the generosity of those big companies giving their 20% time to sort of good projects?
Yeah. Also, I would say that companies also do AI for good. Right? So you can go work for these big companies, Facebook, Google, and work on some of their good projects. I think right now, obviously, we have a limited number of people who have expertise in the domain. And I think we need to increase those individuals who have training, but also there's a bottleneck problem, right? As Professor Goldberg noted, he gets a lot of applications. We need to expand programs, make different programs available, make sure that we have the capacity to teach the future generation, those who will be building AI. I think also this is a technological revolution. It's going to open up a lot more opportunities, not just within these big companies, but we'll have other startups working in this space. And so I think in the future that we'll get more people trained in the positions and more jobs will become available. And I hope that more jobs in applying AI for social good is one of those main areas of growth.
Maybe more an observation than a question related to the distinction being made between autonomous action and as yes, and human intervention called data analysis. There's a thread there in AI going back to kind of the distinction between, let's call it Minskyan AI and artificial intelligence and Engelbartian AI, augmented intelligence. And I just wonder if that distinction, even in the academy, bears some highlighting to really call out the difference between autonomous and still having human judgment involved, just being assisted, and to forfend against the autonomous situation just being a cover for some other human interest to veil itself in some pseudo-objectivity.
Right, I think there's a lot of research moving in this area, and you have, of course, right, you have human in the loop, human on the loop, human out of the loop, in AI-human interaction. And you choose which of those to use based off of the outcome. Some things you can fully automate without having a human, it's fine. But some things you can't, right? It's imperative that you have somebody double checking and ensuring that the decision being made is not going to have negative outcomes. And then there's a lot of research in human AI teaming and how a partnership between something that's automated and then with human decision making can lead to a greater outcome, right? For example, cancer screening. So reading slides to look for likelihood of cancer cells, the machine can pick out a subset, but then if you have a doctor come in, a pathologist, go in and validate and say, yeah, these ones are, the outcome is much, much more accurate. So there's a lot of research in human-machine teaming.
I think we're gonna, oh, wait, one more? One more question.
Hi, thank you so much for your lecture. My question is about AI and special circumstances, I guess. So, for example, like one of your examples was like police training. Let's say someone raises their voice and the AI says, oh, that's an escalating of a situation, but in reality, that's more of a stereotype. It's not really always. So I guess my question is, and this is a concern with self-driving cars too, how do we reconcile when these special circumstances arise that the algorithm has not encountered? Is it just a matter of constantly redeveloping the algorithm, or should we be concerned that we won't even be able to catch these circumstances because AI is kind of taking over? I don't know if that was worded clearly.
No, absolutely it was. I think there's two issues there, right? So if we use AI in these models for the example of the police body cam, right? And somebody raises their voice and it sends an alert, and perhaps, let's say in the future, instead of just alerting the individual with a earpiece that there's likely going to be conflict, let's just say it instead calls in backup, right? Which then could even perpetuate the situation more, right? Because maybe the person just yelled for some other reason, not because they're confronting the police officer. So I think you have to be very careful in the way that we design these models to ensure that we don't have these negative externalities, right? And I think this goes back to our discussion here about always having human judgment, right? Making that judgment call. So it's telling me, it's flagging something, but is this a real flag or is it a fake flag? It's something that's not really important, a false positive. And then I think another thing about the way that we design and apply AI is also making sure that we don't ignore those edge cases, right? The anomalies in the data. The models are really streamlining the data to try to find a pattern. And usually when you clean your data, you get rid of those outliers, right? All of us do that. But if you get rid of those outliers, you might be missing something really critical. So for example, in reviewing the admissions, if you're just looking for certain characteristics, you might ignore the outlier who has this really great additional experience that will be that perfect student to enter the cohort. So I think when we build our models, trying to think through these different types of data analysis and paying special consideration to anomalies and incorporating those into the models as best possible.
Thank you. Really appreciate your comments.